Hey there, welcome to my garage studio and to what I hope will be the first in an occasional series of frequently asked questions about CompGov content for relating to our case study countries and whatever else may be on your mind. The first set of questions that I saw come in over the last week or so of homework readings all related to a variety of the kind of archaic institutions involving big fuzzy hats and frilly uniforms and that kind of stuff in the United Kingdom, clustered around the big question: why is there all this old stuff left in what we are supposed to believe is a modern democratic country? And you guys asked about the monarchy, and you asked about the House of Lords, and then you asked kind of the underlying question of why this country would allow all of these kind of archaic, hidebound traditional institutions to remain, despite their stated commitment to democracy and popular sovereignty and representative government. So I'll try and address three of those questions today. The first is, what the hell does a queen do? She is world famous. Everybody knows her. Many people love her. There's an entire, I think, the world's most expensive television series ever is about her life and her rule. And she seems to be kind of everywhere as a symbol of British sovereignty and traditions and so on and so forth. So, what is it that she does all day? You're seeing her here performing maybe her most pomp and circumstance heavy duty of a job that's essentially all about pomp and circumstance, which is presiding over the annual opening of Parliament. With her husband Philip, who has recently stepped out of these kind of public formal proceedings owing to his advancing age. A couple of formal responsibilities of Queen Elizabeth II, which will pass to her heir whenever the time comes. One is opening Parliament and also proroguing it, which is a fancy British term for suspending Parliament so that the parties can go off and have their conventions. At the opening of Parliament, she reads, as you can see in her hands here, something called the Queen's Speech, which is actually written by the government. It's written by the executive branch, the elected part of Britain's government. Setting out the government's priorities every year, but she does, show up often in the crown and the jewels, to kind of set the tone for the coming year's worth of parliamentary activities, and there is just a huge amount of ceremony associated with that, which I encourage you to read about if you have any interest whatsoever in weird old stuff. Second thing that she does, and maybe the most important thing in terms of day-to-day functioning, is that she has to grant what's called royal assent to bills that are passed by Parliament, in the same way that the President of the United States has to sign a bill before it becomes a law after it's passed by both the House and the Senate. Once the House of Commons and the House of Lords have both passed through a piece of legislation, the Queen has to grant royal assent. Don't, however, think that this constitutes a veto power. The last time a monarch in the UK refused to grant royal assent was 1708, Queen Anne, I believe. So this is essentially done as a mere formality. Um, Third, because she's the head of state, the Queen acts as the commander in chief of Britain's military of its armed forces. Here you can see her reviewing troops, including her grandson Prince William. And so again, this is a duty that the monarch has for a very long time delegated to non-royal authorities. But technically, that's part of her duties as well. She is formally responsible for appointing and for dismissing the prime minister. You can see her here in her first meeting with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the current chief executive, the current head of government in the United Kingdom. Technically, the legal doctrine in the United Kingdom is that all the powers exercised by Parliament are the powers of the Crown in Parliament, meaning that everything that Parliament does is technically being done in the name of the monarch. And so the Queen, the formal nature of the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Queen is that it's the Prime Minister to the Queen. It's sort of her first advisor. And so on again, just a purely formal level, she's responsible for appointing the Prime Minister. Although, of course, her appointment always reflects the choice of the majority of members of the House of Commons. So in reality, it's just confirming a decision taken by a democratically elected body. There has been, the last in the last couple of decades, there have been a couple of situations where no party commanded a majority in the House of Commons, and there was a little bit of uncertainty. There's always a little bit of conversation on sort of the fringes of British constitutional theory about whether, in a case where a prime minister doesn't have a majority in parliament, could the Queen step in and ask the leader of the opposition to form a government in her name instead? And in principle, maybe that's possible, but if the Queen ever did anything that contravened the will of the British people as expressed through elections, there would be a massive constitutional uproar. And so, again, it just hasn't happened. The second question you guys asked, and I really liked this one, it made me do a bunch of research, and I learned a ton while researching this question, is how did the House of Lords lose power over time? And if you've been paying attention to the way that I've described British political history, you will know that the one-word answer to this question is going to be gradually. What I really like about this question is embedded in its phrasing. It contains an acknowledgement that the House of Lords used to be not just the upper house of Parliament, but actually the only house of Parliament, the closest thing there was to a consultative political body in British politics. It originated in olden times as a body of nobles that were summoned on an ad hoc basis whenever needed by the monarch in order to provide advice, or more commonly, in order to consent to taxation whenever the monarch needed to engage in a project or wage a war. It's a good thing to ask your nobles to tax them instead of just showing up and demanding their money. So the House of Commons, the idea that the British people should be represented a little bit more directly, doesn't even come around until the 14th century. Over the next several hundred years, the Commons is going to gradually gain primacy over the House of Lords and become sort of the first house and the more important house in the bicameral British legislature. For the sake of time, I'm going to fast forward to the 20th century and walk you through just a couple of examples of specific limitations on the power of the Lords as a way of illustrating why the Lords might consent to reducing their own influence in British politics. So in 1909, the House of Lords rejects a budget that's proposed by the government, which is dominated by the Liberal Party at the time, and which is passed in considerable margin by the House of Commons. And the Liberal government essentially says, if you're going to try and assert your political power, we are going to pass a law to constrain it. And so the Liberals put forth in the House of Commons a bill which says the House of Lords can't reject bills that were passed by the Commons. They'll be able to delay, they'll be able to debate, they'll be able to amend, but they cannot just say no. This becomes law in 1909, which should beg the question for you, why would the Lords pass a bill which ends their power to not pass bills? And the answer is that the Liberals come up with this clever tactical scheme, which is to say, well, if the Lords don't pass this bill, which effectively destroys their veto power, then instead what we're going to do is just create a bunch of new seats in the House of Lords, and we're going to fill them with liberals who don't believe that the Lords should have the power to stop what the Commons has done. If you've done your American history and you remember FDR's court packing scheme in the 1930s, this is a really similar idea, but a couple decades earlier. So faced with the threat of having their membership diluted and having a bunch of liberals who want to limit the power of the Lords enter their body, the House of Lords says, well, it could be worse, and they go ahead and pass this bill in 1909. That's going to be followed up 2 years later by a law enacted again by both houses of Parliament, which essentially sets a clock on bills that are passed by the House of Commons and says if the Lords refuse to take up these bills after a certain period of time passes, they can become law even without the Lords explicitly voting for them to become law. So that, again, increases the power of the Commons to pass laws without the Lords' explicit assent. Fast forward to the post-World War II period. In 1945, as you might remember, a general election is held and Labour government is voted in. Winston Churchill loses power. And Parliament finds itself in a situation where there's a significant party divide between the Commons and the Lords. There's a significant Labour majority in the Commons, but there is an overwhelming Conservative majority in the House of Lords. And this raises the question of the Labour government is about to embark on all of these really important reforms to build a stronger social safety net, to build a bigger welfare state. and to try and rebuild the economy in the post-war period. And that raises the specter of all of those bills being blocked by conservatives in the House of Lords, which could set up a constitutional crisis because those people weren't directly elected. And so between 1945 and 1951, the Labour and the Conservative leaders in the Lords work out an arrangement that becomes known as a Salisbury Convention. And that's not a law, that's a series of norms, which is historically really, really important in explaining how British politics works. That agreement essentially says that the Lords will not vote down and they will not substantially amend laws which are passed by the Commons, which had been part of the government's general election manifesto. In other words, if the leaders of the House of Commons had campaigned for and won a general election, specifically promising to do something, and then they get the Commons to agree to do that thing, the Lords aren't going to stop them. That helps cement the principle that it's the elected branch of government that gets to do what it wants. Finally, two things happen under Tony Blair, who comes to office in the 90s, kind of promising that he's going to reform the House of Lords. Blair initially comes in with guns blazing, saying, I'm going to make this a primarily elected institution, and that doesn't pan out. But he does manage to make some significant changes. The first is in 1999, when a bill called the House of Lords Act significantly reduces the number of people with hereditary titles of nobility who have the right by virtue of their birth, to sit in the House of Lords. So now there's only 92 of them, where previously there had been 700 some. Finally, in 2005, Blair pushes through the Constitutional Reform Act, which creates, effective in 2009, a Supreme Court in the UK for the first time. Prior to that, there had been a group of people in the House of Lords known, this is the best name possible, as the Law Lords, who served essentially the function of being appellate judges, of being kind of the final court of appeals in the British judicial system. And in 2005, Blair moves that function out of the legislative branch and creates a separate Supreme Court, going into effect 4 years later. There's many, many, many other things we could say about Lords reform, but those are just some highlights that I thought were worth pointing out. Finally, here is the sort of question underlying all of the more technical questions you guys asked me about the Lords, about the nobility, about the monarchy, which is, this is a modern country, this is a democratic country, this is a country which prides itself on being a democracy, so why do they keep all of this old crap around? And again, if you've been paying any attention whatsoever to my class in the last 3 months, I think you know that my answer is going to boil down to one word, and it's not social cleavages, it is legitimacy. The obvious half of this answer is that keeping old stuff around is a really good way to maintain traditional legitimacy, to kind of remind the British people of the long history of their country's tradition of evolutionary and gradual, rather than revolutionary and sudden reform. And the monarchy, and even to some degree the Lords, the idea of keeping around your accumulated political wisdom, are ways of maintaining traditional legitimacy, of reassuring people that no matter how bad things might be in a given moment, they are all part of a system which has produced, good or agreeable results for a long period of time, most importantly, which has sustained stability for a really long time. However, I would also argue that the other thing we need to explain is not just why the British people accept to some degree these traditional institutions, but also why these traditional institutions have consented over the centuries to a reduction in their power, to being reduced to just kind of the wall, the ornamentation on the walls. And that, I think, reflects the importance of rational legal legitimacy. Over and over and over again, in the history of the UK, we've seen the monarchy, we've seen the aristocracy, we've seen the House of Lords as an institution consent to reducing its own power because they understand, based on an understanding of history, based on their reading of the political circumstances, that if they resist, if those non-democratic institutions continue to insist on exercising significant power in British politics, that ultimately the people's desire for a government with rational legal legitimacy is going to cause bad things to happen to those institutions. And so the second half of this explanation, I think, is that undemocratic institutions they realize that people are going to demand ultimately a fundamentally democratic government, and therefore they realize that they have to consent to limiting their own power because the alternative is being eliminated completely. That's all for the first edition of Frequently Asked Questions. If you've got more questions that you want me to address, whether in class or in this video series, please submit them on the Google form as usual. Have an excellent break, and I'll see you next week.